All right, so it is 1 o'clock. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. I will go ahead and introduce myself to get started here. My name is Josh Tenney. I am the content strategist, communication specialist for the CALS LAS web team. I'm here to give you a presentation on how people read your website. My background is mainly, like I said, in content strategy and sort of studying the psychology of what users do and how to best build things so that your users can understand what they do and how to get where you need them to go. So let me share my screen here and I'll get the presentation rolling. All right, so I think I'm the only one presenting today, although I'm sure Anne or Christy may jump in at some point during questions later, because there will be time for questions. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen just fine. Oop, not if I go back, though. All right. Let me make sure that screen share is working. Yep, I've got confirmation there. All right, so let's get started. If you guys have seen my webinars before, you know I've covered some tricks, some best practices, and just a lot of general guidelines for managing content on your website. But this presentation is about why those things work. I'm going to try to give you a really simplified mental model for just a few of the ways that the people who visit your page judge it, navigate it, and read it. So first, let's judge a website. Are you ready? Did you get that? What did you think? I hope you liked it, as that's one of the sites that my team manages. But the key thing to take away here is that's how fast visitors are judging your site. And actually, that might be 10 times longer than necessary. Users make quick judgments. Users form an opinion on your website in 50 milliseconds. And the image that I put up on the last slide was up for 500 milliseconds, so 10 times longer than needed. That is a very, very quick judgment. If you combine this with another fact, which is that the probability of a user leaving your site is highest in the first few seconds, it should be very clear how important that first impression can be. You don't have time to win them over with detailed paragraphs or any other content if your site doesn't pass the initial snap judgment. So you need to communicate the value of your site as quickly as possible. I want to take a moment to mention, however, that I'm not telling you to throw away good content for making your page pretty. I'm trying to show that no amount of depth makes up for a bad first impression, especially if it causes users to leave your site. So what are those users judging in those split-second intervals? Google did extensive research, and this was the core of their answer. If the visual complexity of a website is high, users perceive it as less beautiful, even if the design is familiar. And if the design is unfamiliar, users judge it as uglier, even if it's simple. In other words, users strongly prefer website designs that look both simple and familiar. This quote from the senior user research experience researcher hopefully sounds like suggestions I've made in previous presentations. So how do we make a site simple and familiar? We should aim for low visual complexity, which ironically can feel very difficult and complex to achieve. I recommend starting with a minimalist approach to aesthetics, which generally includes not having content crowded too close together, using negative space, presenting few easy to understand options to users rather than presenting many links and choices, and just generally letting your user decide every next step quickly and easily. Familiarity, on the other hand, is simply matching user expectations for what a site like yours should look like. For those of you working as part of platforms provided by my team or extension, part of this is already done, but familiarity can also extend to specific pieces of content like sidebars, headings, and just general organization. I'll talk about these things a little bit more as we continue. So how do users read content? We've covered that you're being judged quickly and that your layout and general appearance is important, but what about the text itself? Once we're past surface level judgments, how do users actually read content on your site? The short answer is users don't read content. Not usually, at least. What users do is scan content. It's important to rid ourselves of the hope that most users that visit a page start reading and will continue all the way through an entire body of text. Their time is valuable, and they're hoping to pick out the information that's important to them. This is how they do that. In a piece of content without clear headings or other markings, users scan in an F pattern, which describes literally the visual pattern you're seeing there on the right side, where they fixate on the beginnings of lines near the top of the page. The image on the right shows an example of an eye tracking study conducted by the Nielsen Norman Group, where you can see this pattern of heat maps showing where users focused. And you can sort of see that vague idea of an F, where that strong left line with a little bit of veering to the right from left to right. However, there's another pattern where if there are clear headings or bolded focused elements, users use a spotted pattern. This means that they jump between the elements that visually stand out or resemble words related to their task. So how do we take advantage of this? Let's take a look. No need to read the actual text here. This is just a visual example to consider how likely you are to engage with this content at a glance. It's just 3 paragraphs long, but it looks pretty difficult to scan. Let's take a small step toward improving it. First, I've broken it into smaller paragraphs. This is already beginning to look a little less intimidating, but we can do a lot more. Now I've added some subheadings. There's a clear hierarchy of content that makes finding something in that text look like this much easier. Without even being able to read the text, you look at it and you inherently sort of know that it's a simpler process. Let's use a couple more tricks. Now there's even more hierarchy with some additional subheadings. I've bolded some important text, and I've turned one of the lists of sentences into a bulleted list. If we wanted to, including relevant images to break up the content might improve it even more. I don't expect every piece of content to be able to be broken up like this, but it's more doable with most text than people think when they first write something. Hopefully, just by looking at this, you get immediately apparent why content written this way is less overwhelming and less intimidating to users, especially those that are interested in scanning the content rather than reading it. So let's talk about what we did here. We accomplished most of that formatting by using chunking, hierarchies, and lists. If we know visitors are prone to scanning information, we need to write our content with the intent of making it scannable. Break content into smaller, more manageable pieces, which is what is called chunking. Use list formatting like bullets or numbered lists wherever they're appropriate to make sequential content easier to consume. Establish clear hierarchies of information. This is a profoundly effective mental shortcut for scanning content. And if you can, mark important keywords with bolding. And as we've talked about in previous sessions, try to use plain language with low reading grades. Use some of those readability tests that we've talked about before. And if you can, add a summarizing paragraph to the end of a long section of text. So why do users scan? That seems easy because it allows lower effort for a similar outcome. So next we'll cover the sort of website decisions that challenge users and increase effort and what we call interaction cost. Interaction cost is a way to think of the effort a user needs to put forth to do something on your site. It's the sum of the mental and physical effort required. Every action contributes to raising the interaction cost, and different actions have different values. We're not going to give some sort of numerical scale here, but you can think of it in relative terms. Reading and scrolling might have a low base interaction cost, while clicking and typing information in might be a bit higher. Your goal should be to lower interaction cost wherever possible, especially for the target audience for whom you should have a specific goal and set of actions in mind. So how to reduce interaction costs? Lower interaction cost is part of the reason that users value visually simple sites. So that simplicity that we looked at earlier that Google was finding attractive. Users are looking at content and knowing that the simpler content is going to be easier for them. It's going to be easier to process and easier to consume. So this is an application of principles from cognitive psychology where we're trying to strike a balance of making an experience as easy as possible to cognitively process while still providing the information and features that define what we want our website to do and what our website's value is. An easy corollary then is that you should avoid putting too much content on one page. I know that this can seem a little counterintuitive. You might think that putting, say, all your links on the homepage reduces the need to click a bunch of different areas in the site to find something. However, by putting a lot of links on a homepage, you would be drastically increasing the number of choices a user needs to consider before they can actually take an action. Presenting a few options, like a smaller menu or just 3 or 4 main choices on a homepage, is better than presenting many possibilities. You want to make it so that the choices your user is faced with are easy to decide on quickly. More choices than that, and it's harder and takes more time for users to notice the one that they want. I should note that this is easier said than done. Knowing which choices to present is part of the process I've covered in other presentations. It relies on knowing your audience, the information they value, and just generally demographic information about the kinds of things that they're interested in. It's easier to pare down options when you know the choices that they're not interested in too. I won't try to show an example here as it can get a little bit too specific and there are caveats, but I would say that if you find yourself with pages that are long, crowded lists of links, as many resources pages, for example, often become, try to take the above information and consider if users are really able to process that page effectively. The last section I want to talk about is some myths. It may be that certain design decisions are made under the impression that users will or won't do a certain thing. It's important to separate the fact from the fiction and dispel the myths that might lead to worse design. I'm just going to cover a few, so please feel free to ask questions at the end about perceptions of user behavior that you've heard or assumed or that could use clarification. I know there's all of us are trying to make decisions thinking that the users might do one thing or might be inclined toward a specific behavior. So if you're not sure about one that you've heard, please let me know. Myth number one. This is an old and persistent myth. Even if this was once true, the ubiquity of social media products with endless feeds has long since eliminated any major aversion to scrolling. With that said, even though users do scroll, there's some truth to the information, to the idea that the information above the fold gets more attention than the information below it. That shouldn't be surprising based on what we've talked about so far. So you still need to put priority information at the top. What's important to learn here is that it's not necessary or recommended to crowd your content above the fold just to avoid making users scroll. This is one of those things where we're trying to strike a balance. So balance the limited interaction cost of scrolling versus the interaction cost of having a crowded page above the fold. Myth 2. Users should find what they need in 3 or 4 or 5 clicks. The fact is, there is not a defined number. Fewer clicks can be good if it can be achieved with the simplified design principles we've talked about so far. Fewer clicks is bad if the only way to achieve it is to put an overwhelming number of links on a single page. The myth has the appearance of valuing simplicity, like you're trying to make it so that the user can get through quickly. But often it leads to poorer designs in the hope of hitting sort of an arbitrary and unsupported number that doesn't really have any basis. As I hope I've made clear in my other webinars, designing for usability rarely has clear-cut numerically defined values. The best practices are almost always about a balance. Myth number 3 is that users will start on your homepage. When we build a site, and I'm guilty of this myself, it's easy to get locked into the homepage focused view at the expense of simplifying and improving the appearance and usability of all your content. The fact is that users will start wherever they start, most likely from Google search results. Find your most buried, specialized, specific piece of content. Can a user that lands there still clearly recognize where they are and find what they need? I'm not saying to ignore your homepage. Users who land elsewhere will frequently go to the homepage first to get their bearings, but remember that it's not the only path through the site, and some users will miss it entirely. Specifically, your main menu navigation should also be simple and clear as it displays everywhere that your users go. Myth 4, simplicity means minimalism. While I give examples of using minimalist aesthetics to create simplicity, this can be a slippery slope. One example I like to give is that replacing a text link with, say, a really simplified icon to represent it that no longer has the text, that can reduce clarity. It appears to reduce the amount of things on the page. You've changed text to just have a single icon that's really, you can add a lot of padding around it. But if users don't immediately know what that icon means, then you are much better off with something that takes up a little more space and defines clearly what that object is. Clear descriptive labels might seem less simple than an icon, but they are more simple to process and understand. So less is not always simpler. It's important to think about design as making a complex goal easier to achieve rather than simplifying the goal itself. So I'm getting towards the end of my presentation here, and I wanted to add just a few key takeaways. I hope this presentation is giving you some mental model for how users cognitively process the experience of using your website. Designs and content based on user psychology and essential behavior patterns will last longer. The driving mechanisms behind the psychology is mostly not going to change. So designing around these principles can help guide even the most exceptional or unusual content toward usability. What may change is familiarity. As users become more accustomed to features in other contexts, and they begin to have value rather than being confusing when used. A good example of this is the hamburger menu on a mobile version of most websites. I'm guessing, I know several of our websites have them. That made the gradual transition from maybe something that somebody wouldn't recognize to something that is now so familiar that it's expected. Another takeaway is that when deciding between presenting lots of options or a simplified experience, simplicity usually wins. And lastly, it gets really tempting to look at these facts and think that users are lazy or they're impatient. But these behaviors are things almost all of us do when we're browsing the web because they shield us from fatigue and overload. Your user will make easy choices and not optimal ones. Thanks for listening. If anybody has any questions, I'll field those now. I did want to mention on this one that I had some sources. Most of what I've talked about can be verified on the Nielsen Norman Group, which is a fabulous resource for user experience questions. And most of their articles are written exactly the way that I talked about here with lots of bullets and headings and hierarchy. It's pretty great. And I mentioned some insights from the Google AI blog and some additional notes from the CXL Institute. So Anne asked me to explain the fold. The fold is, it's borrowing terminology from newspapers, which is the idea that above the fold is what you see when you fold the newspaper in half, that top part that's visible right when it's at the front of a newsstand. So the fold on a website would be the content that when you load a page is immediately visible without having to scroll. The idea that I was trying to dispel is that it's really, really important to get everything above the fold, which is kind of a mixed bag. So that's what the fold is it's all the content that's at the top part of a website right as soon as you load it without having to take any action. Fred asked, does this work for blogs too? I would say that the textual simplification things definitely work for blogs. I mean, it's still always a good goal to try to make it so that users can scan your content easier. A blog is not going to be any exception from any other type of content. Hopefully, if they're following your blog, they're a little bit more interested in reading it from start to finish. But it's always, they can still read it start to finish, even if they've used some of the tools to sort of simplify that experience. Does that answer your question, or let me know if you have a more specific question about what part of this works for blogs?
I did have one more thing that I can add when talking about the fold, and Josh, maybe you can talk about this a little bit as well. But sorry, I just want to make sure you can hear me okay and have the right speaker select. When you talk about the fold, and so above and below the fold, the thing that I have found is also important is just to make sure that people know that there's something to scroll for. So
right.
Yeah, so in some cases, I mean, obviously you're viewing on different displays, but if it looks like your image like ended and there's just white space, people may not scroll if they don't know. Actually, I'm asking that question actually, because do they not, or do they still scroll to find out?
what you're referring to is called a false floor. So the idea that somebody looks at a page and assumes there is no more to see because there is no visual indicators that they can go further. So yes, it's good to have those. The problem with prescribing that is something else I didn't mention, which is that everybody's viewports are different. People on mobile, people looking at several different possible screen resolutions. Where the fold falls is going to be different for everyone. So, I mean, I guess I would say that currently full 1080p, 1920 by 1080 is fairly ubiquitous. I definitely wouldn't say that. I don't want to give the impression that that's a rule. If you were going to try to do what Anne's describing, which is have some content sort of hang over that fold so that they know there's something to scroll to, that's a good idea. I would also check that on mobile, although I will say users on mobile are going to be much, much more predisposed to scrolling automatically. The idea of them not scrolling below the fold isn't really possible on the mobile version of most sites. So give a minute just if anyone else has any other questions. All right, I don't see anything else coming in, so I guess I can go ahead and end here. No problem with ending early. If anybody has any questions, they can feel free to get in contact with us. We've got web support at iustate.edu. I don't know which email Christy prefers if for her clients. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us. This recording will be available on a URL. Oh, so we've got another question here. Given that the original time someone looks at a site at 0.05 seconds, what is the best thing to put on your site to get them to look for more? I enjoy that factoid. Actually, it's not a factoid, that anecdote. It's not so much true that they only look at the site for 0.05 seconds. It's mostly that they begin to form an impression that remains consistent at that time. So as far as what to put on their site, it's going to be really, really case by case specific. And that's why I focused on the familiarity and simplicity. So basically, it's more the idea that what they see in that immediate initial load should be well spaced out, and it should be really clear what they're looking at. As a general rule, I'm a big fan of what we all commonly see on most websites. I think if I describe a large banner with maybe 3 buttons below that banner that generally guides people into a certain buckets of content, that's really popular and really common on websites we visit for a reason. Yeah, so a big photo at the top of the page is the way to go. I'll at least say, I never want to prescribe anybody a way that all sites should be, because it's going to change depending on what you do, and especially if you're in a different field or something where the other comparison sites might be different. But I will say it's ubiquitous for a reason. People will look at it and they'll be familiar with what they're getting. So as far as familiarity, it's not a bad place to start. It's much better than trying to reinvent the wheel and present something that's unfamiliar to users.
I'd also say that just to add to that, just remember that when you have a really big image, if you're putting a link on that image, or you're trying to get people to go somewhere, like maybe there's a caption and a button, and there's a really big event, or there's why people are coming to your site, and you want them to know right away where to go. I would assume that's a good thing to do. But just note that it takes a lot of real estate to do that. And so if you have maybe 3 different priorities that you're trying to promote folks to get to, like maybe you have, as Josh Tenney has done a great job talking about before, specific goals for your site, you're going to want to make sure that you don't use all of that real estate up, and that you use it wisely. So again, I think Josh is right on point there, and I defer to him for more detail, but just to think about those types of things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add even more so that whenever we give people advice about what banner to put on their page, one of the other things I say is make sure it's a really good photo. You'll meet that expectation of it being familiar because you have that layout. But one of the things you'll notice about really high profile sites that use the large hero image is that usually there's a very clear focal point on those images. So even that is relatively simple. Your eye knows exactly where to go on an image that's really high quality, usually is like a shallow depth of focus and a clear place where you're supposed to look. So even down to those details of what's in the image can make a difference. All right, so with that, I think I'll start telling everybody thanks for coming, and I hope that you guys got something out of this, and I think we're planning to do this again next week. So you guys should get an invite for that and not too long, hopefully, after we decide what we're going to cover. So thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of your days.